This project's been about 2 years in the making and was inspired by several YouTubers, including Jimmy DiResta's Star Key and others who showed how to put a key into a multi-tool. And I wanted to create the ultimate everyday carry utility tool, so I didn't have to carry a heavy bunch of keys jangling around in my pocket, and at the same time allowed me to carry some tools that would be useful, including a torch. I started with a Victorinox rescue tool, and using that as a base I created a torch from scratch using a super bright LED. I wanted to use a joule thief, which is a circuit that allows a voltage to be increased for the purposes of powering certain components, and it relies on an induction coil and a few other basic components which I first tested on a breadboard. And after quite a lot of research I found the Cree XP-G2 LED was one of the most powerful for its size, and I obtained a few online. The LED needs a 3.1 volt input, but I wanted to use a commonly available yet small battery such as a AAA, so the Joule Thief circuit allows the 1.5 volt AAA to power the 3.1 volt LED. The other advantage of the Joule Thief is that it allows you to use batteries that are almost completely dead otherwise. So if one had been in a clock and the clock stopped because of battery running out, the battery would still have enough power for the Joule Thief. The LEDs come mounted on this disc, so the disc needed to be reduced to save on size, and I also needed to make a reflector for the LED to try to give the light output some direction. So I used some 6mm aluminium rod, drilled a hole through it, cut off a short section, then used a ball-nosed milling bit to create a rounded profile on one end. I used perf board to mount all the components onto and cut it to the exact size of the tool scales. Then I attached copper brackets to the board near the battery compartment end because I planned on using screws through a metal strip at the positive terminal of the battery to hold the battery in and to create the positive connection to the board. I created the battery compartment using epoxy, which I mixed with glow-in-the-dark powder so it might be easier to find if I lost it. And I shaped that to correspond to the side of the tool and drilled out the battery slot. Then I salvaged a spring from a battery box to use against the negative terminal of the battery, and it was a fiddle to get that in place. This is the bracket against what will be the positive end of the AAA battery. This is the components in place. This is the reflector glued onto the LED. Then I had to encase the rest of the components in epoxy. I plugged the switch and the LED with blue tack so I could peel it out once the epoxy had set. Then I did a bit of finish sanding, and it actually fits quite well onto the side of the tool. Overall I'm quite pleased with the way it turned out, but there are a few things that didn't go quite so well. Firstly, bubbles in the epoxy, which you can see. If I'd known about heating the epoxy at the time, I would have tried that. I probably would have also invested in some nice clear epoxy so I can see the components better, as they look quite cool and quirky. Somehow the perf board curved between the start and the end of the project, which I think is an intrinsic property of the perf board if it gets damp, because it happened to the rest of the stock that I left in my garage too. So it's not just because the epoxy got to it. If I'd anticipated this, I'd have tried to anchor the perf board down so it stayed straight. I'd also like to have thought of a better way of doing the battery compartment so it didn't have to have those ugly screws sticking out the bottom. And finally, the whole thing is absolutely massive and I have to take it out of my pocket to sit down, so despite all the work that I put into it, I don't actually use the torch, but it does work great as a standalone torch. The next video shows how I incorporated the key and the final result.